All right, guys. Day two. Um, we are continuing through the chapter 4 notes. If I can get my mouse back. Aha. Chapter 4 notes. We're going through 4.2 and we're going through slides 13 through 30 today. So, kind of a lot to go over. But a good portion of this is going to be review stuff. So, it's stuff that we've already seen. Um, some of it that we haven't, like a good portion of it that we haven't. But biotic and abiotic factors, that kind of stuff, yeah, we've looked at it. So let's just jump into it, get started, and hopefully this goes pretty quickly. So, what shapes an ecosystem? Last week we talked about living factors or living things that affect and influence an environment, and we talked about the non-living things like rainfall or water or salt in an area. Biotic factors, these are the biological or living influences on organisms within an ecosystem, whereas abiotic factors are the physical or non-living factors that shape ecosystems. Together, these biotic and abiotic factors determine the survival and growth of an organism and the productivity of an ecosystem in which the organism lives. So it's not just focused on one particular thing, one particular species, or one individual. It's focused on the health of the whole ecosystem, so all of the things living there. So, biotic factors, we got things like the trees, the grass, the moose, the bunny, all of the living things inside that picture. An ecosystem is all of the factors, including geography, back there with the mountains, including water sources like this little pond, and the living things. And of course, abiotic factors, we're just looking at the non-living things. So if there was nothing alive there and it was just water and mountains and that kind of stuff and weather, this is what we would have for the abiotic factors in our ecosystem. So the area where an organism lives is called a habitat. So a particular organism will live in a specific place, whether it be a nest or a burrow or on the move. It could be on the move in a group, large herd. These are the habitat of an organism. And a habitat includes both biotic and abiotic factors. So how does that individual organism interact with the living part? So does it eat things? Does it get eaten? And the abiotic factors. How does it get nutrients? How does it get water? How does it get the salt that it needs? Does it take advantage of certain geographical features in an area? Those are all things that contribute to an organism's habitat. If an organism's habitat is its address, its niche is its occupation. So once again, we're trying to put things in people terms. So an organism, its habitat is where it lives. So like I particularly live in Bloomington. Most of you probably live, most if not all of you, live in Brown County, Nashville, or the surrounding areas. Its niche is its occupation. So all of your all's occupation would be student at the moment. Some of you have other jobs. Your parents, they have different occupations, but they, I'm sure, live at the same address as you. Some of you maybe not. I don't know. But address is where you live. Niche is what you do. So how do you fit into your community? A niche is the full range of physical and biological conditions in which an organism lives and the way in which an organism uses those conditions. So think of a niche as like your special ability. So where do you fit in? Each ecosystem has different organisms and they all fit in a different way. An organism's niche includes the type of food it eats. So maybe the prey that it hunts, how it obtains food, its place in the food web. So is it a producer? Is it a first order consumer, second order, third order? The temperature it needs to survive. That's key. So how hot does it need to be? Is it warm-blooded? Is it cold-blooded? Where does it live? Does it live in a tree? Does it live in a burrow? Does it just sleep out in the open? Those are things that influence its niche. And how and when it reproduces. So is there a seasonal reproduction time? Like, is it spring? Does it reproduce all year long? Does it only reproduce at night? Those are all things that need to be taken into account when determining a niche. And a niche is basically kind of what I've been saying, an organism's role in the ecosystem, its job, its one thing that it does well. The competitive exclusion principle states that no two species can share the same niche in the same habitat at the same time, or at least not for very long. If they would, competition would result in death or displacement of one of the species. So you often see a lot of this, like the Galapagos finches. The problem with the original finch species that came over from South America, they all fit in the same niche. So they all ate the same organisms, they all lived in the same types of places, and when you've got a lot of birds living in a close proximity to one another, they all fit the same niche. So they had to diversify. They started eating different things, and their beaks shaped to that type of thing. Maybe they reproduced at different times. So they just switched off so that they could diversify their roles, their niches in their ecosystem. However, different species can occupy niches that are very similar. So let's look at an example of that. So 3 species of warblers and their niches. Mainly, the difference here is where they eat. So they all eat in the same types of trees, right? We've got the spruce tree. Warblers, they're going to be eating in these spruce trees. So the bay-breasted warbler here, this orange one, these feed in the middle parts of the tree. So they eat in the same trees, yes, but they only eat from one particular zone in that tree. Yellow-rumped warblers, they feed off the bottom parts of the tree, the bases. And then you've got the Cape May warbler, it feeds up here at the top. So in order to avoid competition, they decide to fill different niches, even though they're very similar. They probably eat the same types of food, eat during the same types of day, you live in the same types of areas. But because they diversify in where on this tree they're getting their food from, they are able to distinguish themselves from the others and avoid competition. So they don't overlap on their niche. So once again, let's come back to the Galapagos. I talked about that a minute ago when I was talking about filling different niches and why there was a whole big diversification of the species, the original species that came over from South America. But if we look at these different niches in the Galapagos, the blue-footed, red-footed, and Nazca boobies exist in the Galapagos Island. These are all different types of birds. In order to coexist, these birds must have different niches. So in order to live together in the same types of environments, they have to make sure that their jobs are different, so not everyone's working the same job. They nest in different locations and hunt for food in different areas of the ocean. So basically, they zone off different areas where they're allowed to fish and hunt. Think of it this way. Like if we had, say, Brown County, and every single person who lived in Brown County, their one specialty, their one job was to go out to the parks and look after things and make sure everything's running smoothly, do ecological studies, make sure there's no toxins introduced into the nature park. And that was everyone's job. So the only people who lived there, only people who lived in Brown County could do that one specific job. Well, first of all, there's a whole lot of other jobs that, don't get done. And secondly, there'd be a whole lot of people out of a job because there's only a certain need. There's only a certain amount of positions open for that job. So everyone else, you're jobless. So avoiding competition is a very good thing. That's why people get different jobs, because there's different things that need to be done. In the same way, in nature, these different organisms will try to avoid competition with one another by filling different niches. Now, there's also community interactions. This is when organisms live together in ecological or when organisms live together in communities, they interact constantly. These interactions help shape the ecosystem in which they live. Community interactions such as competition, predation, and various forms of symbiosis can powerfully affect an ecosystem. So, community interactions on a very basic level is just how do the organisms in one particular area interact with one another. And there's a bunch of different ways that they can do that. So first way is competition. Competition occurs when organisms attempt to use an ecological resource in the same place at the same time. It might be a watering hole. Two different organisms try to secure this resource at the same time. Nutrients, light, food, space, mates, even plants can compete. Look at a forest. It's a perfect example. You don't see a whole lot of grass on a forest floor. Why? Because the trees are taking up most of that sunlight. There's not enough that reaches the ground. So grass can't really survive right around a tree. It doesn't get any sunlight. So resources, all of these are examples. So the competition is the first way that these things can interact. Another big one that you guys I'm sure will know is predation. This is an interaction in which one organism captures and feeds on another organism. So predator is the one that captures and feeds on the prey. So predation relationship, one thing eats another. It might be a fox eating a rabbit. That's predation. It might even be a cow eating grass. Technically, one is the prey, the other is the predator. One is eating the other. So that is a predation relationship. So let's look at something which we'll actually come back to later when we'll look at how populations change. Later this week, we'll do a lab together. Or try to. It's going to be kind of tough. It might be a 2-day video thing. But the lynx and the snow hare have a predator-prey relationship. And their population numbers are directly related to one another. You see the lynx here in blue, the hare here in red. Anytime the hare, so the rabbit population goes up, the lynx population lags behind a little bit, but they go up. Why? Because they got an all-you-can-eat rabbit buffet, right? Well, the problem is the lynx, they start getting more numerous, and they start reproducing, and they get crazy. They're everywhere, and they eat all of their food source. So there's a massive drop in the rabbit population. What happens to the lynx right afterwards? Well, another couple years, they die off too, until you get to a point where the hare doesn't really have very many natural predators. So once again, boom, they shoot up. Their population spikes. Very soon after that, lynx goes up too. So these predator-prey relationships, their numbers are tied directly to one another. And we'll look at some things in the lab later this week where people have come in and tried to influence these relationships to make sure one particular species can live a little bit better, maybe a cuter species, and it ends up backfiring horribly. So we'll see how people can screw things up. Another version is symbiosis. So any relationship in which two species live closely together is called symbiosis. So this is like a daily, weekly thing where they interact with one another all the time. Or sometimes their life is literally dependent on the other. One is. So biologists recognize 3 types of symbiotic relationships in nature. There's mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. Let's take a look at mutualism first. Mutualism is a mutually beneficial relationship. There's plenty of examples on the screen here. You got the bumblebee and the flower. Obviously, they get the pollen, which they use to make their honey. The flower, they get to, have their pollen spread. There's tons of. My favorite example is probably those little birds that go and clean the alligator's teeth. or the crocodile's teeth. That's my favorite one. So the crocodile doesn't eat the bird because it's getting a free teeth cleaning, and the bird gets a free meal. It doesn't have to go out and hunt. So it's a mutually beneficial relationship here. The second one is commensalism. Commensalism is when one member of the association benefits and the other is neither helped nor harmed. One is lichens, which we've talked about before. If you remember when we were talking about pollution in England in the mid-1800s during the Industrial Revolution, there was a whole lot of pollution that discolored the lichens on the trees. So if you go out to the woods, you look at a tree, you'll see a bunch of like white mossy looking stuff on the side. It's kind of like on the bark. Those are lichens. Barnacles living on whales. The whale's unaffected. He's like, whatever, dude. But these barnacles get a free ride and a free meal at the same time. And the third is parasitism. Parasitism is when one organism lives on or inside another organism and benefits while harming it. So right here, we've got lice, athlete's foot, a big old tick sucking the blood. So they live literally off of you. This is ringworm. These look like leeches, tapeworm, and yeah, more leeches living on that fish. So in parasitism, one is literally sucking the life or feeding off of the other one while it's still alive. So if the host dies, the parasite would die as well. The last thing we need to do, and we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on this because I'm not really going to quiz on it or anything, is ecological succession. Ecological succession is just how do ecosystems change over time. Ecosystems are constantly changing in response to natural and human disturbances, so what nature does and what humans do. As an ecosystem changes, older inhabitants gradually die out and new organisms move in, causing further changes in the community. The series of predictable changes that occur in a community over time is called ecological succession. The two main types of this succession are primary and secondary succession. So let's go ahead and look at primary succession. Primary succession is something that occurs after, some catastrophic event. A volcano goes off, boom, everything's covered in lava, there's no soil, no erosion, nothing, no plants, nothing's there. In this case, there's pioneer species that have to move in first. You've got nothing but exposed rock. Lichens usually move in. If you go out and look at the rocks, you can usually find these green lichens. Here's a picture of them right here. But what they do is chemically, they are excreting enzymes that break down the rock and the stone, and then they reabsorb those nutrients from the absorbed rock and use it to grow and to live a little bit further. In that process, they gradually break down that rock into the first layers of soil. And once that's there, things like grasses can come in. So you'll get small herbs and underbrush coming in there next. After that, you'll get bushes, and then finally small trees, and eventually a large forest. It's just a predictable change over time as more and more soil gets created, and basically life moves into an area. And the second time is secondary succession. This is what occurs when soil is already present after a disturbance. So a farmer plows, a forest fire happens. If you look out in California, they have forest fires like yearly during their drier seasons. That's not the end of life. The soil is already there. It's ready to go. But the plants have to start start growing again. In fact, some trees can't reproduce, or their seeds can't take unless there's a forest fire. So they have evolved to deal with things like forest fires. The final and most stable stage of succession is called a climax community. So think of a forest, a fully grown forest, like a rainforest. That would be a climax community. You've got a whole lot of community interactions. You've got a lot of vegetation. You've got a lot of animal life. And a whole lot of various species living in one particular area. That is a climax community. That's where everything goes. And the marine ecosystem, we're going to skip that, and we're going to cut it off. That's about 20 minutes for today. So I'll go ahead and end that for you guys. Anyway, the quiz will be up here soon, or the note check. So look for that. See you guys tomorrow.